Hello, my name is Maxine and I'm a forensic speech and language therapist, senior clinical lecturer and course lead for the Masters in Speech and Language Therapy at the University of Central Lancashire. I'm here today to talk about some of the research I conducted whilst doing my PhD at the University of Manchester, which was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm always really grateful when people give up their time to hear about developmental language disorder. I'm going to speak about a few things today, but first of all, I just want to get some terminology out of the way. So we're going to consider language and developmental language disorder to check your understanding is the same as mine. We're going to have a brief look at the current knowledge of language abilities in youth justice populations before I move on to some of the research I've conducted with first-time entrants into the youth justice system. We'll look at psycholinguistic and socio-emotional characteristics and then rates of recidivism. And I'll summarise each section as I go. Then at the end, we'll pull it all together and try to think of some ideas for moving forward. So I hope you've all had your 3 Weetabix. Inevitably, I'm going to power through this and omit certain areas and gloss over others. So if I miss something that you want to know more about, whether it be findings or methodology, then please email me as my details will be on the last slide, and I'm always really keen to have conversations. Now, when I'm talking about language or oral language, I'm talking about everyday talking and listening skills. And you'll hear these referred to as expressive and receptive language. So my expressive skills refers to my ability to put my thoughts, my feelings, my ideas into words and sentences. So I know the meaning of those words, the right word order, the grammatical structures, and all the cohesive devices that link ideas and clauses together. So I can tell you my story, and you in turn are using your receptive language, so your auditory processing skills, you're accessing the meaning of the words and the grammatical structures to pause and make sense of what I'm saying. So you know, for instance, that there's a meaning difference in the boy kissed the girl as opposed to the boy was kissed by the girl, even though in both sentences the noun phrases are in the same order. So it's terribly important when we think about the language skills, especially the language skills of vulnerable young people, that we remember that language is a two-channel process. And we're not just thinking about what the young people can say, we also have to consider what they can understand, which is largely invisible to us and vulnerable to change depending upon context, the environment and the emotional state at the time. And in my experience, this subtlety is easily glossed over, and it's easy when we talk about a young person's language skills to fall into the trap of just thinking about their expressive skills. So developmental language disorder describes when somebody has difficulty with understanding or using language, and these problems affect functioning in everyday life and educational progress. DLD makes it hard for young people to use specific vocabulary instead of empty words like thing or stuff. And young people with DLD find it hard to learn new words. They have a very shallow vocabulary, and it's very difficult for them to express themselves, for them to tell their story, to articulate their thoughts and feelings and their ideas. And they find it difficult to produce long and complex sentences. Now, we don't use long and complex sentences to be fancy. We use them to link ideas together, like saying who did what to whom or when something happened. So if a police officer wants a young person to give an account of what they've seen or information regarding an incident, a young person with DLD may appear evasive, like they're perhaps holding back or rude or even guilty. Young people with DLD often describe to me that they can't understand all the words around them, like people are speaking a foreign language or all the sounds are jumbled up. And they describe an inability to keep up with conversations and frustration at not being able to express themselves. So it's not likely to resolve spontaneously. It's a persistent, pervasive, hidden disorder, and it can occur with other neurodevelopmental disorders, and it's often masked by them. So we may see the autism or the ADHD, but not the language disorder. Now, when people ask me about the client group I work with, and I say young people in the youth justice system or in secure provision, they always look slightly puzzled. And I like to ask people what comes to mind when they think of the typical young person in contact with the youth justice system. And depending upon the audience, there are slight variations in the answers, but the most common characteristics that people always say are male, usually aged between 14 and 17 years, disadvantage from a low socioeconomic status, perhaps social services involvement or looked after status, usually involved with substance misuse and possibly not accessing education. Now, difficulties with communication skills or developmental language disorder never seems to be at the forefront of people's minds. But the literature tells us that it should be. There's a growing worldwide literature demonstrating an association between language and behaviour. And cumulatively, this evidence suggests that a disproportionate number of young people who come into contact with the youth justice system have developmental language disorder. So research in the UK has considered a variety of samples. Professor Karen Bryan has considered incarcerated samples and those in secure children's homes and reported prevalence rates of developmental language disorder ranging from 42% to 67%. And she found similar high rates of young people serving intensive community orders. Dr. Hopkins at Birmingham University considered young people perhaps on less rigorous court orders, and a sample of non-offenders matched on non-verbal IQ, social disadvantage and years of education, once again finding a much higher prevalence in the young people known to the youth offending services. And a striking similarity in these studies is that the language difficulties had previously gone unrecognised. So perhaps the full consequences of coping with unidentified language development during these developmental years may only be realised years later. So we have this good body now of robust worldwide evidence that consistently identifies young people in the youth justice system as a population that is high risk for clinically significant yet undiagnosed language difficulties. And when we consider that language is fundamental to how we participate in the world and how we learn, it's not surprising that DLD commonly occurs with externalizing difficulties. And in fact, they can mask the DLD, which can often masquerade as non-compliance or rudeness, and can stand to disadvantage the young person in his or her passage through the youth justice system. So if we think about referral orders that operate on the restorative justice principles of responsibility, reparation and reintegration, we can assume that RJ to a certain extent relies on a young person's language abilities, as they have to comprehend and provide complex accounts of the offence in narrative form. So effective communication in this context relies on a young person's ability to sustain attention, process the language of others. The young person must be able to comprehend and use vocabulary describing mental states and emotions. They're also expected to have adequate narrative skills to perhaps explain their actions and intentions, and then communicate remorse and regret with some degree of sincerity. Quite often they have to listen to the victim or perhaps a proxy victim and then negotiate how reparations can be made. And all this occurs in the context of elevated stress, which further impacts on communication. So restorative justice principles do assume some open communication, but communication is not a skill that these young people bring to the table, and therefore they may be unable to benefit from the rehabilitation on offer, and there's the concern they could then be pushed further into the youth justice system. So I was really interested in the prevalence of DLD in young people who were new to the youth justice system as opposed to incarcerated individuals. So I recruited a sample of 145 young people accessing youth justice services in the Northwest, both from youth offending teams and a triage centre. All the young people had English as a first language, and no other exclusion criteria was stipulated because I really wanted it to be ecologically valid. The mean age of the sample was 15.8 years. And I really wanted to contain the sample to first-time entrants. And although this wasn't always possible due to methodological challenges, the sample mainly consisted of young people new to the youth justice system. Now, young people in the youth justice system are a really hard to reach group, so the language assessments had to be speedy, and I wanted to try as much as possible to mirror what is required in restorative justice. And also in designing this study, I involved youth offending teams as much as possible to try and gain that buy-in. So the language measures also had to be acceptable. And I used 2 subtests of the KELF. So I used formulating sentences and understanding spoken paragraphs. I considered a non-verbal IQ measure, and the index of multiple deprivation was applied as an ecological measure of socio-economic position. Now, because this was a multi-site study, I had to stick to the variables that all 5 sites definitely collected. So there was a pragmatic decision with the variables included in the adversity score. And these were whether a young person was not in employment, education or training, whether they self-reported alcohol use, self-reported drug use, whether there was nobody in the house in paid employment, and whether they had a looked after status. And I also looked at the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and I also looked at the Alexithymia scale. I operationalised developmental language disorder as a score of 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So it was a standardised score of 78 or less, or on the 7th percentile or less. Now, I won't read all this out to you, but it gives you a flavour of the young people that I saw. 77% were male, which reflected the national picture at the time, because the Youth Justice Board figures reported 80% male at the time. A quarter of the young people were not in education, employment or training. A quarter were reported having special needs, but only 16% had an EHCP, an education, health and care plan, and those fell into 3 categories. It was social emotional mental health difficulties, autism or attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. The overwhelming majority of the young people came from the most deprived areas. So I said I was interested in the first time entrance into the system, and this table just refers to the 96 young people who had not previously committed an offence. If you look at the descriptive statistics, we can see we've got the DLD group, so this is the people who scored 1.5 standard deviations below the mean or less on the standardised tests. And then the other group, which I termed as non-DLD, and they're in the next column. So exactly 50% of the young people that I saw scored a standardised score of 78 or less, or fell on the 7th percentile or less on the language measures. And there was no significant difference between this DLD group and the non-DLD group in their adversity scores, or age at first offence, or their socio-economic position. So exactly 50% of brand new entrants that I saw into the YJS have language scores in the clinical range. When I looked at the language scores for the full sample of 145 young people, the DLD split here was 87 young people in the DLD group and 58 in the non-DLD group. So here there was a prevalence of 60% in the DLD group. The mean language scores for the DLD group was more than 2.25 standard deviations below the mean. In fact, the group as a whole had a bell curve which seems to completely shift to the left. So as these young people travel through the youth justice system, they're required to understand information given to them. This begins at the arrest stage and continues beyond the disposal of an order. And some of these young people may be able to self-monitor, identify and address any difficulties they encounter. But this is not the case for all the young people in the YJS, and some face challenges that are hidden or misinterpreted. So from now on, the results that I present will refer to the whole group. So that's the whole 145 young people. Interestingly, only 2 people reported seeing a speech and language therapist when they were in primary school. So it was very much the hidden disorder in the group of young people that I came across. So just to summarise, 50% of the first-time entrance evidence scores suggestive of developmental language disorder, and this increased to 60% when I considered the 145 young people. There was an increased prevalence of DLD in the group of young people who had committed one or more previous offence when compared to the first-time entrants, and this difference was statistically significant. It perhaps suggests that the prevalence of DLD increases as youths become more entrenched in the youth justice system. But we really need to be cautious here due to the extremely uneven numbers of the samples. This wasn't something I set out to look at, and these are very uneven group numbers. But despite this significant difference, the prevalence of DLD in first-time entrants was still high and within the range of previously published material. So moving on, I considered socio-emotional difficulties, and I was looking at this from the perspective of any group differences between those with and without DLD, but I was also interested in the group as a whole. So another factor that may provide barriers to effective rehabilitation is alexithymia. So this refers to difficulties in experiencing, expressing and defining emotional responses. It's described as having three factors, which are identifying, describing your own feelings, identifying the emotional states of others, and then an externally orientated style of thinking. Professor Pamela Snow in Australia has previously reported a high prevalence in young people, the receiving end of the youth justice system. Now, you need a good vocabulary to express emotions, and it seemed really intuitive to me that language skills may be implicated here. But they weren't. The alexithymia scale captures the three interrelated elements, and as you'll see, there were no significant group differences on the alexithymia measures for the total score or any of the individual factors, and there was no difference if we considered the categorical scores. So 60% of the young people met the criteria for alexithymia or possible alexithymia, but it was not distinctly associated with DLD. Rather, it manifested as a comorbid condition. I also considered the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, and some of you may be familiar with this. This looks at internalising and externalising difficulties. It considers emotional difficulties, conduct problems, hyperactivity, peer problems, and then there's a positive scale of pro-social behaviours. And once again, there was no group difference here between developmental language disorder and the non-developmental language disorder groups. So in summary, 60% of the young people met the criteria for alexithymia or possible alexithymia, but it was not distinctly associated with DLD. And I think revealing that difficulties with language and alexithymia cluster in young people in the YJS is important when we consider that restorative justice concerns itself with verbal information pertaining to expression of emotions. So young people may be compromised in their ability to engage in these strategies that are on offer. 54% of the sample had total difficulty scores in the borderline or abnormal range. And interestingly, I know I've glossed over this, but there was no significant gender differences in any of the psycholinguistic or socio-emotional measures apart from higher levels of emotional difficulties in females. So I then wanted to look at developmental language disorder as a variable in respect to rates of recidivism. So recidivism, reoffending, is a priority for the Youth Justice Board, and to measure recidivism, Cox's proportional hazards models were fitted, and survival time was measured not from the arrest but from the date of the young person's order commencing. I felt anything prior to that would have been the effect of the arrest, and I wanted to consider the effect of the youth justice intervention. For the sake of survival analysis, a young person survived if they remained conviction-free for 52 weeks. I didn't measure reoffending on the basis of arrest, as that could be biased if individuals with DLD are more likely to be arrested because they can't talk their way out of something at the scene of an incident. So for me, conviction data felt a more robust measure. So in this sample, 46% of the young people reoffended. And once again, this was very similar to the YJB figures at the time. They published it was 42% reoffence rate. And this was for the year 2017 to 2018. So it was well before lockdown was something that we knew about. Just to orientate you to this, we have our group status in one column and whether or not there was a reoffence in the rows here. So 34 people of the DLD group did not reoffend and 53 did. And 44 of the people in the non-DLD group did not reoffend, whereas 14 did. And this difference was statistically significant. So I then used survival analysis to examine the link between offender characteristics and the rates of recidivism. So just to orientate you again, the time in weeks is along the x-axis and the proportion of participants who did not reoffend on the y-axis. And you can see each downward step represents an event, so an outcome of interest, which in this case here is reoffending. So here we can see at day 1 and day 2 we're still at 100% because nobody is reoffended. And then we start to see the event of interest, so people start reoffending, and that's what each little downward step is. And I followed these people for the full 52 weeks, and the cumulative incidence of the absolute risk of reoffending within a year of the young person's court order was 62% for the DLD group and 25% for the non-DLD group. And an issue worthy of note was of the young people who did reoffend, 77% from the DLD group and 71% from the non-DLD group had reoffended within 26 weeks. So youths entering the youth justice system with unidentified developmental language disorder were at greater risk of recidivism. So after making sure the data met the assumption of proportional hazards, I ran survival analysis, and these are the results of the adjusted analysis. As one would expect in the bivariate analysis, each predictor, apart from the IMD score, because both groups were from such deprived areas, was significant. But in this final model, only 2 predictors were significant. DLD was the most significant predictor of a risk of reoffending with a hazard ratio of 2.6. So if you were in the DLD group, you were 2.6 times more likely to reoffend. Now, sequential admission of the non-significant predictors in the analysis revealed the same significant predictors. And I also ran some sensitivity analyses. In order to control for developmental difficulties, I omitted the participants with a registered special need. And I also fitted the adversity measures separately in a series of 5 models. And this didn't alter the findings. So what does this mean for the youth justice system? Well, I think weak language skills may preclude young people from deriving the full benefit of all the good rehabilitation that's on offer. And we need to think of more robust ways of identifying developmental language disorder as young people enter the youth justice system. Relying on objective measures or self-report is just not sensitive enough. In order to facilitate this, we need strong collaboration. We need to work together, and I think we are starting to do this now. But strong collaboration between youth justice staff and the speech and language therapy profession is very much warranted. And finally, current intervention strategies utilised in the youth justice system would benefit from differentiation. The YJS matches intervention to a perceived level of risk, and it does so using this risk needs and responsivity model. A risk assessment is central to this, but when attempting to predict the likelihood of reoffending to target those at greatest need, I think the language status may be inadvertently overlooked. We need to work smarter together and harness our respective areas of expertise. I'd like to acknowledge the ESRC for the grant received that allowed me to conduct this research, and also acknowledge Professor Jeannie Conti-Ramsden and Professor Roger Webb, who were my supervisors when I conducted this research at the University of Manchester. I'd also like to thank the youth offending team managers, the caseworkers and the triage centres that I worked in. They opened the door to me and incorporated my research into their working week, making sure that every new young person that was referred into the service was also referred to myself. Lastly, but by no means leastly, I want to thank the 145 young people who took part in the research. They worked incredibly hard at tasks they found incredibly difficult, and I am forever grateful to them. And my email address is also on this last slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for listening.